I thought we would start by jumping right into it. And it's a statement you made recently, which was the Communist Party of China is responsible for the pandemic. Please, Robert, explain.
Well, so a lot of people get hung up on the origin of the virus, and I think that is an answer we're not going to have until the end of the Chinese Communist Party, as was is normally true for any totalitarian regime. You don't get access to the archives until it fails. But what we do know, and what has been made public by the Communist Party itself, was that on the 7th of January, Xi Jinping was running the crisis in Wuhan personally. Now, I know from my past as a defense attaché and senior defense official in Beijing that when Xi Jinping gets eyes on a problem, a crisis, or a budding confrontation between the US and China, he's very directive and has direct control. Now, I was there in Beijing a week before they took the UUV in the South China Sea, which was a underwater glider. I watched how Xi Jinping executed direct control over the captain of the ship in the South China Sea as we were negotiating the return of that vessel. So I know that if he says on 7 January he was in charge of the crisis, he was in charge of the crisis. We also know that in December, the Chinese Communist Party knew about human-to-human transmission, and there's public evidence of that on the 13th of January. So 7 January, he's in charge. 13th of January, they publicly acknowledge human-to-human transmission. And what's going on at this time? The highest peak season for travel in China for New Year's. So 7 January, 13 January, then 23 January, they close Wuhan. Now, the Wuhan mayor says at that time that already 5 million people have left Wuhan. We also know that based on a DHS report that came out this week, that they turned from a net exporter of PPE, protective gear for frontline responders for coronavirus, into a net importer during the same time frame in January and February. So they're importing much more PPE than they're exporting at the same time that they're telling the WHO and everybody else that there's nothing to see here. So we have evidence there that, it was purposely done. So disregard where the virus came from. The pandemic itself was purposely executed by the Chinese Communist Party. For what means, we don't know, but we do know that they profited from the sale of PPE after the coronavirus started, and were, essentially exporting panic to the rest of the world.
So purposely done, that means they knew that it was going to be spread human to human. They knew it was potentially dangerous, and they didn't contain it?
That's exactly right. Actually, it's partially right. They began to take measures to contain travel domestically within China, but internationally, they were continuing to promote that travel. And in late January, our president, basically banned travel to and from China. But what we didn't ban was travel to and from Europe. And so Europe was getting the travelers from Wuhan, and that was infecting Europe. And then our major infections came on the East Coast of the United States. No surprise, because that was delivered from Europe.
Right, and I think they've even genetically proven that most of the U.S. Cases came from Europe based on the mutation strains. So that's a bold statement to make, General, that the Communist Party, encouraged the spread of a disease. I mean, that's...
Well, but I mean, it's facts. It's not, when you look at the information, it's not conjecture. You can actually see a pattern of behavior reinforced by the importing of PPE and the banning of exporting of PPE during the same time frame that shows a premeditation in terms of what they were trying to do.
Wouldn't they be concerned that it would take out their own population?
Well, so, I mean, I think you bring up a good point. And when you don't understand the nature of the Chinese Communist Party, then you don't understand the way that they look at their own people. So the Chinese Communist Party actually is a regime that has in the past killed tens of millions of their own people. And they did this during the reign of Mao Zedong. And Mao did it in the Cultural Revolution, really primarily and with the rise of the Red Guards, primarily to exert political control over leadership of the Chinese Communist Party. So he was willing to create chaos and cause the deaths of tens of millions in order for him to get political control. So when you don't actually view your citizens as citizens, but rather as subjects, then the ability to do whatever horrendous thing comes to mind because it benefits your own power becomes available. You can also look at the current regime and say, okay, well, they have concentration camps. They have forced organ harvesting of prisoners of conscience. And they have the most executions of any country in the world. So clearly, this is a regime that doesn't care about what happens to its citizens. It's really about only power and control.
So that's just friendly fire if that happened. And they're known as these great long-term thinkers. And if that's the case, if you're thinking 100 years out or 200 years out, then 10 million people here or there is less of a concern.
Well, I mean, yes, and it's sad to say, and it's horrendous, and we would never think that way. But we live in countries where, citizens are actually, it's not a government that is subservient, or not a people that is subservient to a government, as in China. We live in governments that are subservient to their people. And that's a completely different philosophical approach to governing a country. And I think, we've seen the difference, particularly. There's a stark contrast between how the Chinese Communist Party approached the coronavirus and the government of Taiwan. The government of Taiwan being a democracy where the government is essentially under the power of the citizens, really reacted quite differently. They sent investigators to Wuhan in December. They asked the right questions. When they didn't get the right answers, they came back. They sent a letter to the WHO saying they were concerned about human transmission. On 1 January, they started boarding aircraft coming from Wuhan to make sure that there was no infections. They started then banning flights to and from Wuhan and really began to institute more aggressive measures. And to date, they've had the best response of any nation out there in terms of how to respond to the coronavirus. It doesn't matter if you're an authoritarian regime or a democracy, their lessons learned from 2003 and SARS and the inability to trust what the Chinese Communist Party was saying, they put into action. And unfortunately, nobody else in the free world did. But if we just contrast those two models, clearly, the openness, the transparency, the caring of the citizenry that comes from a democracy shows very brightly in Taiwan in terms of how they address the issue.
Okay, back to the Chinese Communist Party. Why would they allow this to spread? Because they could foresee the economic damage it would happen on the world, and then they would be the ultimate winner? Is it that clear?
Well, so I mean, there's two ideas that I have come up with. The first was really the realization that their economy was going to be impacted as they began to deal with the repercussions of the spread of the disease. And why should their economy be the only one to suffer? The other is really about the price gouging that's been happening because they basically locked down the worldwide supply of PPE. So I think part of it was to make sure that they weren't the only ones affected negatively, but then also to positively profit from the spread of it by having all the PPE.
President Trump has hinted that the Chinese were behind it, or they should have told us earlier. But there's a lot of blowback when you start accusing governments of allowing the spread of such a disease. Do you have people that disagree with you?
Oh, I'm sure there are. But, let's go back to World War II. I think, in the beginning, Churchill was hammered because he was saying we need to do something about the Nazis. And in fact, the majority of people said, no, we need to kind of, embrace them. We need to bring them into the family of nations. This is the same thing that's been going on in the United States and other countries, other democracies, as the Chinese Communist Party has risen and gained more and more power. In fact, we help them gain in power. So I'm not surprised that there's still a large contingent of people that wants to give them the benefit of the doubt. But then you have to ask, you have to wonder, the fact that we're talking about concentration camps and forced organ harvesting today, and that doesn't give them pause with regard to how we address this regime. You just have to wonder about what are their motivations? Why do they think this way? And in fact, I've talked to a lot of them, quite frankly, their motivations are essentially profit-based. So I really don't have a lot of, sympathy for the way they feel about the Chinese Communist Party, when a lot of it is based on the millions or billions that they're making based on their relationship with them.